What's up, guys? Welcome back to Taking the Field with Stevie Mac. On this episode, I'm joined by a special guest, Brandon Biagi, to recap this past weekend in PLL action. We've got a special thing we want to kind of really, I think, hammer on in this episode, which is why I brought him in specifically for this, so that we can kind of hammer out those details a little bit. We'll, of course, get to some other things later on. But Brandon, first off, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, Stevie Mac, thanks so much for having me. We've been going back and forth on Twitter for a while, like years now. So I feel like this is overdue, and I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, like I said, good to have you. So to jump right in, as I kind of teased in the open, the thing that we really want to touch on with this episode was something that you tweeted out after this weekend's games, particularly about the Redwoods, and you mentioned a potential Redwoods rebuild and maybe how you would start that or what that would look like. So I'd love to get your kind of in-depth take on that here in just a moment, because I do have like I said, before I get to you with this, I do have some thoughts on this. I'm not against the idea of the Redwoods rebuilding. I definitely think that it's something that they could explore. But for me, the first thing that I thought when I saw kind of your input on it on Twitter the other day was that we've never really seen a team in the PLL, at least that I can remember, rebuild mid-season. Not saying that they couldn't do it or that they maybe shouldn't do it, but it's just we've never really seen a team do it. I mean, you think back a couple of years ago, the Atlas waited till after the COVID bubble that season to kind of blow it up. They traded the guys that they did, got the picks back in return. Saw a couple of years ago in the offseason, the Cannons did so as well, kind of reshaping their roster. They brought in Coach Holman during that offseason. So we've never really seen a team do so mid-season. Again, not saying that they couldn't do it and couldn't pull it off. And then I think the other thing for me too was that I think it's a lot easier for these teams to do these kinds of things in the offseason because of the way that it's set up, where you have free agency, you have the trade windows open, obviously the draft, and then it looks like some of the coaches are even using the championship series now in the off season to kind of evaluate some talent, even if it's on other rosters. Like I know Coach Pressler talked about bringing in Ronan Jacoby, who was there during the championship series, and he said that he was a guy that they had identified during the championship series and brought them in. So obviously, like I said, I'd love to get your take on the whole idea of a Redwoods rebuild, but at least for me, like I said, that's kind of where my head was at with it, is that you, of course, could take the shot at doing it mid-season, but I think that if past history kind of tells us something, it's that they'll more than likely wait till the off-season.
Yeah, I think you're probably right on that. The Redwoods are the team, even coming into the season, I was the lowest on. I just feel like it's the same song and dance every year with them because it's the same core, right? It's Nat, and it's the same core. So I think it's just played. I think they need fresh pieces. I would go younger. I actually floated this idea prior to the draft, and I said something like, I guess we can start with the Chris Gray trade. I liked the trade just in theory of you're getting Chris Gray for the 5th overall pick, and Chris Gray's a known commodity. Chris Gray, I'm pretty high on. He's like one of my favorite players to watch, and I think he's exactly what the Redwoods needed because of the way he plays. But starting all the way back then, I'm okay with trading the 5 pick for Chris Gray, but where you go from there, I would have kept tearing down and rebuilding. And what I threw out before the draft was, how much do you think needs to be packaged with Pinnell, with Jack Kelly, and with others? Like, how many other pieces need to be in a deal that garners you enough draft capital to walk out with Liam Entenmann and another attackman to replace Rob Pinnell, or like other pieces that will bolster your roster? I think at the end of last year, or like going into the draft, Pinnell still has value because he's dedicated. You know, he's got at least one more season. Trading him mid-season now at his age, I think a team would have to have a commitment or a buy-in from him that if they're going to sell draft picks or players, um, that they would have to know that Pinnell's going to stick around for a while. I don't think there's a huge market for a ball-dominant ex-attackman right now. So I don't know if you are going to be able to move him this season. I also know that there was an interview that Hutton Jackson did with him on Pro Lacrosse Talk that he said he wanted to retire a Redwood, and I just kind of get the feeling that like with this league, with Rabel running it, with Nat, I think that like they're not going to just trade away one of like the staple pieces over like the last 12 years. Like I think they'll try and do him right. So like I really don't know where it goes from here. I don't think you can move Pinnell at the moment. But what I think this offense needs, and I've played midi and attack my whole life. So when I watch these games, I watch it through an offensive lens. I don't have too much recommendation for the defensive side. But on the offensive side, you have a couple ball-dominant attackmen in Pinnell and Garnsey. And what I thought this offense needed and what I thought Chris Gray was going to bring is moving the ball quickly and making quick decisions. Getting back to like the 3-second rule. Like catch it, know where you're going to feed or hit the dodge early. Like what I don't like watching is when the ball gets to any attackman. I'm having this problem with Connor Fields actually right now with watching the Archers, but any attackman, if it gets to them, if it's not like a yellow transition situation, if it gets to an attackman and they back it out and they wait and then they come get a long dodge started and then they back down for a while and then they throw some fakes, the defense is just sitting on them there. And these guys that I'm talking about, Pinnell, Garnsey, and I threw Fields in there, I'm throwing him under the bus for no reason, but those three, I just think they're so talented that they get through it. Like Garnsey does this thing where he has one hand on the stick, he's rolling on the ground, he's getting hacked by 3 different guys, and he still scores a goal. But it's awesome to watch, but it's not conducive to building offense around. So I think what I would do is I would tear this whole thing down. I think there is a market for Garnsey, who is a super skilled lefty. I think there is a market for him if they wanted to move him now. There's definitely a market. The other one I had crossed out was Romar Dennis. My issue with Dennis is that he is very skilled at one thing, and everybody knows it's coming every time he has the ball. It's a 2-point shot, whether it's on the run or it's a step down. You know exactly what's coming there. So it doesn't bring any layers to the offense at all. If I was going to redo this offense, I would get as much as I could for Garnsey and put Chris Gray at attack. I would get rid of Romar because he's going to have a market. Somebody's going to want that 2-point stretch threat. So I would move him and get as many pieces as I can. And the ones that I would really want to stick with, that I marked on this tweet, I would stick with Westberg for sure. I would stick with TD at the stripe, Jared Connors, LSM, and then the middies I had marked down were Chris Gray, Charlie Bertrand, Garrett Degnan, and Brian Tevlin. And then Cole Kirst wasn't on the graphic, but I would keep him too. I thought last year when they had Kirst, he brought like this youthful energy to the offense, and I thought every time he was in, it seemed like good things happened. Like, moving the ball quickly, hustle plays and stuff. I just think you want to get away when your team has been this like 500 stagnant situation year after year. I think you need to do something different, and I think the answer is like youth, quickness, fast offense, moving the ball. So that's the overall idea of what I had. If you could get something for Pinnell, I think an interesting offensive situation would be Westberg, Chris Gray, and then you could even put Degnan up there. You could put Connor DeSimone, who's a free agent, up there. I think there's opportunities, and I don't think that attack line is going to be, like, I'm not necessarily sure if replacing Rob Pinnell and Ryder Garnsey with Chris Gray and Garrett Degnan is going to be much better, but the sum of all the pieces, if you have draft picks or if you can get other players that can contribute in other spots of the field, I think I'd rather roll the rest of the season with that, and you have an attack unit that's going to work with each other, and you know that's going to go into the future because you don't know how much runway Pinnell has. What you do know if you put Chris Gray and Wes Berg and young guys up there is they can start building into the future, and you might end up with a really good, you might end up with the first overall draft pick in the process and a number of draft picks for Pinnell and Garnsey. So that was my overall thought and my long-winded way of saying that.
Yeah, and I thought kind of what you said there towards the end about, you have some of these bigger name guys like Pinnell at attack, but maybe you can move those pieces in and still be kind of okay because maybe even though they are some of the bigger name guys, maybe the fit just isn't quite there anymore. I think you could kind of look back to, I know I said kind of top of the show, a team like the Atlas a couple of years ago. They had, Ryan Brown, they had Rob Pinnell, they had Paul Rabel, all in that same offense, all huge names, all Hall of Famers, and you're like, well, maybe 5 years prior those pieces could have fit together, but at the time it didn't work. They had one of easily the worst offenses in pro lacrosse, at least within the last however many years it seemed like, because the statistics back that up, it seemed like, from what I remember. So yeah, that's just kind of what came to mind when you said that was, think back to that offense, you had all these big name guys, but they couldn't score goals. So I guess kind of what good did it do you to have those guys on that team, and they were all then shortly after traded. And I thought it was interesting that you mentioned Romar was kind of one of those guys on your cut list from that graphic that you put out the other day. He was a guy that I was actually, for maybe lack of a better word, relieved when the Atlas traded him last year. And I almost want to say that if you look back on it now, because I'm not a big, grading trades kind of guy, but I think if you look back at it from what we know now to this point, is that you almost get the sense that the Atlas won that trade because Romar was on the last year of his deal last year, whereas they got Miles Jones back, who had this year on it as well. Atlas didn't have to give up a pick or anything in order to make that deal, and Miles has been, by at least many accounts, I would say, probably more the productive player for the Atlas, or even if you wanted to look at it from the other side and see what Romar's done with the Redwoods. I know he had a pretty solid weekend, it seemed like, this weekend. But I think all things considered, you'd still say Miles has probably been the more productive over the course of their tenures with their new clubs. So yeah, I think for me it was, I in the moment felt like the Atlas probably got the better of that trade even back then. So it's been nice to see that it has actually kind of worked out that way. Because anybody that's listened to this show knows that I'm more of an Atlas fan myself. Not that I have anything against the other clubs. It's just the team that I've kind of rooted for since the very beginning. But kind of just to keep it moving, I know, like I said, top of the show, for anybody listening on whether it's iHeartRadio, TuneIn, Apple, Odyssey, basically anywhere you get your podcast. I'm joined here on Taking the Field with Stevie Mac by Brandon Biagi, talking some Redwoods potential rebuild, if you will. But we're going to kind of keep the show rolling along now that we've made it through that. I want to get your thoughts on the Water Dogs face-off situation. Obviously, we know the big storyline the first few weekends was they didn't have a face-off guy rostered on their game day roster. This week they did with Alex Stathakis. I had Wyatt Miller, their beat writer, on a couple episodes ago and got his take on it because obviously he's a little more embedded with the team than maybe I am, so I got his thoughts on it, but I'd love, since you're here, to get your thoughts on it as well.
Yeah, I liked both of those interviews with the Water Dogs and the Chaos beat writers that you had on. The Water Dogs bringing on a face-off guy, I was in support of. I placed my biggest bet of the PLL season on the Water Dogs to win this week, so that worked out well. I thought it was also right that they used Stathakis too. I know there was chirping of people suggesting that it would be Connor Farrell, but I thought he's a player that we've seen what he has. Let's bring on a new guy and see what he can do. And the thought for me was, I don't necessarily think that the no face-off thing is a bad strategy. I actually just think the Water Dogs did it in a bad way. So, like, week one, you tire out Courier, and he's completely wasted pretty much on the offensive and defensive side because all of his energy is going to faceoffs. So, like, I like the idea of giving it a try, but week one, you learn that doesn't work. So then week two, you go in, and the first game, I believe they did Courier for most of the time. The second game, they did short stick D middies. The issue I have with this was not that they were, like, I think they were doing it right. I just think the execution was wrong because the short stick D midi was not pressuring Joe Nardella whatsoever. It was basically like whistle blow and retreat. And then Nardella picks up the ball and he can either take it or he can pass it. Like, at least they have some really athletic short stick D mids. Put those guys, Richard, Witcher, Scarpello, those were the three that they went with this past weekend. But if you put one of those guys on and at least just, like, when the whistle blows, don't immediately retreat, but play defense and make it hard on them. Be on their hands. Make them have to control it. I think that's a possible, like, that could work because they were 0-3, all one-goal games, and they lost two of them in overtime. So that's my overall thought on the strategy. On the actual execution of the Water Dogs, I thought they played pretty good games. I had them power ranked as the fourth best team in the league coming into this week. So I had them ranked. Well, it was one spot above the Chaos in my mind. I think their overall team play has been better, and the margins are so slim in the PLL that even if Stathakis goes like 40%, which I think he did somewhere around there. He still won 8 possessions for them. That slim margin swings it from losing it in 1 goal to overtime to winning by 4, pretty much.
Yeah, and to that last point you just made, that was something that in that previous episode about a week or so ago now, with Wyatt Miller, the Water Dogs beat writer, I did mention that with him and I think he even said it as well, is if you even get anything out of that face-off position, you're probably winning these games that have come down to maybe 1 or 2 goals, which, like you said, pretty much all of them have. So that's just how important that was. And he even mentioned how after week 1, and I think I mentioned it as well in that same episode, is that Coach Tierney even said, hey, even with our lack of success at the face-off, like, we're still within a possession or maybe 2 and still had chances in the end of, especially that week 1 game. They had maybe 4 chances in the last 3 minutes of that game to try and tie or take the lead and just couldn't do it. But again, it kind of comes back to the whole, like you said, if you even get anything out of the face-off position going forward, you're definitely, I think, setting yourself up for a better situation. So again, just a couple more things to get to with this episode. Again, taking the field with Stevie Mack, talking with Brandon Biagi. The Atlas had been on a roll through the first 4 games or so of the regular season. Their offense averaging, if I had to venture a guess, probably somewhere around 17 goals per game. This weekend they ran into the Whipsnakes. Second time already this season they've seen the Whipsnakes, so it's definitely tough to beat a team twice, especially in that short amount of time in just a few weeks. But I'd be interested in getting your thoughts, kind of maybe what you took away from that game for both sides.
Yeah, Stevie, I thought it was an impressive showing from the Whipsnakes. I loved the rookies. TJ Malone has been awesome, steal of the draft. I am the biggest Levi Anderson fan, as a St. Joe's grad. Adam Poitras and Jack Corus, even though Corus gave Schellenberger that gift on the doorstep. But those 4 rookies all contributing, that was like kind of the juice that the Whips needed, it felt like. Because at times, the Whips kind of go through that situation with Zed a little bit, where the ball kind of gets stuck in there sometimes, and you want to see it go faster. Then you put these 4 rookies in there, and this is what they needed because they weren't getting production out of many other people earlier in the season. The Atlas jumped out to a 5-1 lead, and then I think they got complacent because they jumped out and they were like, oh yeah, we're just going to roll everybody like we always do. But it was and Constantine broke out of the slump. That was nice to see. But really, my thoughts on the comeback were more defensively. I found myself asking for Shelly and Teat to get more involved on the offensive side. Like, it was cool that Costabile was scoring and he had the confidence, which is great, but that offense has to run through Shelley and T. And I don't know if that was like I don't know if that was just game flow that kind of got lost, or if Zappatello really had the clamps on Shelley, because I thought that I needed more aggression out of Schellenberger, and I just think that the offense needs to run through those two every single time, every single possession. It needs to hit both of their sticks, and I think they were trying to create from up top, and time ran out on them.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the same thing that I would take away from it from that game, especially on the Atlas's side of things. Is I think it seemed like there was points during the game where you could point to certain plays, especially on ground balls and things like that. The Whipsnakes seemed like they got their fair share of ground balls in that one, so it almost kind of felt like after, like you said, after the Atlas got up 5-1, it almost seemed like the Whipsnakes just wanted it more in those kinds of situations, like the 50-50 ground balls and things like that. And then to your point about the Atlas offense maybe getting a little too complacent, is that was something that even earlier this season, like in week 1 or 2, they said on the broadcast, is the problem with the Atlas and the way that they try to get everybody involved is that, kind of like you said, there's times where Teat or Schellenberger should be kind of taking control and trying to create things for themselves, but they're too busy trying to get everybody else involved. And it's like sometimes you just have to, I think, know when to be a little more selfish in that situation, because there was stretches of that game where they were just kind of settling for certain shots and not necessarily getting the looks that you're used to seeing them get. So I think if those two in particular can get better at sort of picking their moments where it's like, yeah, I could make this pass here, but I think I really need to maybe take it myself here and try to see what I can do. Maybe that's something. But I do remember after week 1, because the Atlas had 2 games in week 1, I remember back to the episode that I did after that weekend, and I said that obviously you can't expect them to score 17, 18, 20 goals a game like they did that weekend. But when their offense is on, they're going to be almost impossible to stop. But I did expect sooner or later that they were going to have a game like this where maybe they jump out early in the game and then kind of slow down a little bit, and then they can't kind of get it back going again, or maybe they start out slow and then they couldn't catch up. So I knew a game like that was coming sooner or later, just because they can't keep up that kind of pace for a full season. But I definitely think it'll be interesting to see how they come back this next weekend, because I believe it's the Outlaws that they have, and I think the Outlaws have proven that they can pretty much hang with anybody. They might not win, but you at least have to kind of think about it a little bit, especially after that game they had with the Archers. So I think it'll definitely be interesting to see how the Atlas bounce back from that, and maybe how the Whipsnakes carry that performance into their next game. I believe they have the Archers. Yep, I wrote down they have the Archers, so it'll be interesting to see maybe how they carry that performance into their matchup with the Archers. Because, yeah, I had the same thing for the Whipsnakes as well. I thought their rookies, guys like Malone and Anderson, were probably their 2 biggest players in that game. Obviously, defense stepped up a lot after they got into that early hole. But I think overall, yeah, just like I said, it just seemed like the Whipsnakes definitely wanted it more in that one. So final thing to get to with this episode, talking with Brandon Biagi here on Taking the Field with Stevie Mac, from Michael Ramirez, good friend of the show, by the way, on Twitter, says, I'll stay this easy jerseys looked absolutely fire on the field this weekend, not a single miss. And this was something that we talked about off the air before we started recording this episode. So I'll kind of step out of the way and let you give your takes about the jerseys for this weekend. But Michael Ramirez again on Twitter asking about the Indigenous uniforms that they wore this weekend.
Yeah, those were a 12 out of 10. They were probably the best jerseys that the PLL has rolled out. I loved the Indigenous artwork. I think everything that the way that they looked was awesome. Think everything that they represent is awesome, and I think it's a good tribute for the game to do. I think I'm not the only one thinking that they should wear those every week of the season. from here on out. I was a little disappointed with the uniforms that they rolled out, like the week to week uniforms. I was definitely underwhelmed with. So, and then I was completely overwhelmed here. So I think they should just roll with these from here on out. Total masterclass by the design team with the logos and the uniforms there. So love it.
Yeah, I did as well. I told you kind of off the air, like I said, we talked about it briefly before starting this episode. I definitely liked the color and just the, like you said, the design and even what the uniforms kind of represented in that case with what this past weekend for the league represented and what they were able to do with that. So I think just overall, like you said, they absolutely nailed it with these. And it was funny because somebody under the comment that Michael had left about the uniforms, somebody actually commented similar to what you just said and said they actually like these uniforms better than their week in and week out uniforms. So I don't think, like you said, I don't think anybody would have an issue with it if they decided maybe later on this season to whip them back out for another weekend just for the sake of doing it maybe. So I think a lot of people would be on board with that. And I have a feeling that after this weekend they're going to be selling a lot of those jerseys in the PLL shop as well. Well, Brandon, I want to thank you again for joining me on this episode.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Stevie Mac. It was a good time. Glad to be on with the voice of Detroit lacrosse.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that, and I appreciate you taking the time. That was Brandon Biagi here on Taking the Field with Stevie Mac.